The phone rang. Johnny Carson picked up the receiver and froze when he heard his mother's voice say, "Johnny, I never stopped loving you." The Tonight Show. Studio 6B. NBC Burbank. March 1978. A Thursday night like any other. Johnny Carson behind his wooden desk, blue cue cards in hand, delivering his monologue with that effortless timing that had made him the king of late-night television for 16 years. The audience was laughing. Ed McMahon was chuckling in his seat beside the desk. Doc Severinsen and the band were ready with bumper music. 300 people in the studio and 15 million watching at home, all settling in for another night of comfort and laughter before bed. Everything was routine. Everything was safe. Until the phone on Johnny's desk rang. It was a prop phone, had been for years. A 1970s beige rotary model that sat there for sketches and bits, never actually connected to a working line. Johnny had used it hundreds of times for comedy. Fake calls with celebrities, prank conversations, sight gags. It never actually rang. But tonight it did. A sharp, insistent ring that cut through Johnny's punchline and stopped him mid-sentence. He stared at the phone. Then at Ed. Then at the cameras. That's not supposed to work," Johnny said, his comedic timing perfect even in confusion. The audience laughed, thinking this was part of the show. The phone rang again. Johnny reached for it slowly, playing it for comedy, expecting some producer's prank or technical malfunction. He lifted the receiver to his ear, still looking at camera one with that bemused expression his viewers knew so well. "The Tonight Show," he said in his smooth, professional voice. And then his entire face changed. The smile vanished. His hand gripped the receiver tighter. His other hand came up to steady it, both hands now holding the phone like it might slip away. His eyes widened, then glistened. His jaw clenched. The audience stopped laughing. Ed McMahon leaned forward, concerned. Doc lowered his trumpet. "Mom?" Johnny whispered, his voice catching. Is that really you?" The studio cameras were live when the phone rang. Johnny Carson answered saying, "The Tonight Show," and the voice on the other end made him freeze completely. "Johnny, I never stopped loving you," his mother said. The control room erupted into chaos. Director Bobby Quinn was frantically pressing buttons, checking audio levels. "Whose phone line is that? How is that phone connected? Who's calling him?" Producer Fred DeCordova stood frozen, staring at the monitor showing Johnny's face, a face that had maintained perfect composure through thousands of shows, now crumbling in real time on live television. "Don't cut," Fred said quietly. "Keep rolling. Whatever this is, keep rolling." On stage, Johnny had turned away from the cameras, the phone still pressed to his ear, his shoulders hunched. His free hand had come up to cover his eyes. Ed stood up from his seat, uncertain whether to intervene or give Johnny space. The audience sat in complete, confused silence. This wasn't comedy. This wasn't a bit. Something real was happening. Johnny's voice, barely audible over the boom microphones, whispered, "I thought you were. Mom, it's been 15 years. I thought you'd never." He couldn't finish the sentence. His voice broke completely. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. To understand what was happening, you need to understand what happened in 1963. Johnny Carson wasn't always Johnny Carson, beloved host and America's comfortable goodnight. In 1963, he was 37 years old, newly hired to host The Tonight Show, terrified he'd fail, and desperately seeking approval from the one person who had never given it, his mother. Ruth Carson was a difficult woman. Cold. Demanding. Critical. Johnny had spent his childhood in Norfolk, Nebraska, performing magic tricks and comedy routines for anyone who would watch, desperate for his mother's attention, her approval, her love. She rarely gave it. "You're wasting your time," she'd tell him when he practiced card tricks at the kitchen table. "You'll never make anything of yourself doing foolishness." When Johnny got his first radio job at 14, his mother said, Don't quit school for this nonsense." When he went to the University of Nebraska to study broadcasting, she said, "You'll end up back here working at your father's store." When he got his first television job in Omaha, she didn't visit the station. When he moved to Los Angeles and started hosting game shows, she didn't call to congratulate him. And when NBC offered him The Tonight Show, the biggest job in television, the dream of every performer, the validation he chased his entire life, his mother's response was, "Don't get too comfortable. You'll probably lose it." Johnny invited his parents to the first Tonight Show taping in October 1962. His father came. His mother declined. "It's too far to travel," she said, "and I don't like to fly." Johnny sent her tickets anyway. She returned them unused. For the first year of The Tonight Show, Johnny called his mother every Sunday. She never asked about the show. Never mentioned seeing him on television. Never acknowledged that her son was becoming one of the most famous people in America. In October 1963, almost exactly 1 year into his tenure as host, Johnny called his mother on a Sunday morning like always. He'd just been featured on the cover of TV Guide. The ratings were soaring. He was being hailed as the savior of late-night television. "Mom, did you see the TV Guide cover? I don't waste money on magazines. Mom, the show's doing really well. We're beating everything in the time slot. You sound tired. Are you drinking too much? Mom, I wanted to hear you say you're proud of me. Just once." There was a long silence. Then Ruth Carson said in that flat, dismissive tone Johnny had heard his entire life. "Proud of what? You tell jokes on television. Your father and I built a real business." That's something to be proud of. Something in Johnny broke that day. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet snap, like a wire pulled too tight for too long finally giving way. "Okay, Mom," he said quietly. "I understand." He hung up. And he never called her again. His father would call sometimes, brief, awkward conversations where either man knew quite what to say. But his mother never called. Never wrote. Never acknowledged the son who was now hosting 15 million viewers every night. 15 years passed. Johnny Carson became an icon. The Tonight Show became an institution. Johnny married, divorced, married again. He bought houses, won Emmys, became one of the most powerful men in television. And he never spoke to his mother. In interviews, when asked about his parents, Johnny would deflect with a joke. "They're very proud," he'd say with that trademark smile. "They just show it in unique ways." But the people close to him, Ed McMahon, Fred DeCordova, his closest writers, they knew. They knew about the Sunday phone calls that had stopped. They knew about the invitations to tapings that were politely declined. They knew that Johnny Carson, who could make America laugh every night, carried a wound that never healed. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Nobody knew how the phone line had been connected. Technical crew would later discover that a production assistant, new to the show and unfamiliar with the prop phone policy, had accidentally plugged in a working line during setup that afternoon. It was supposed to be disconnected. It had been disconnected for 16 years. But tonight, through a series of coincidences and technical errors, Johnny Carson's desk phone was live. And at 11:47 p.m. Pacific Time, Ruth Carson, 73 years old, living alone in Norfolk, Nebraska, had dialed the NBC studio number she'd kept hidden in a drawer for 15 years and asked to be connected to Stage 6B. "I need to speak to my son," she told the switchboard operator. "Ma'am, the show is live. I can't." "Please," Ruth had said, and something in her voice made the operator pause. "Please. I'm his mother. I need to talk to him." The operator, against every protocol, had patched the call through to the prop phone on Johnny's desk. The phone that was never supposed to ring. The phone that was ringing now. On stage, Johnny was still turned away from the cameras, the receiver pressed to his ear, his shoulders shaking. Ed McMahon had moved closer, standing just behind Johnny's chair, one hand hovering near his friend's shoulder but not quite touching, giving him space but offering proximity. The studio audience sat in reverent silence. Many were crying, though they didn't fully understand why. They just knew they were witnessing something profound and private made public. Johnny finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Why now? Mom, it's been 15 years. Why are you calling now?" The boom microphones couldn't pick up Ruth's response, but they caught Johnny's reaction. His hand trembled on the receiver. His eyes closed. Tears ran down his face. Johnny Carson, who never cried on camera, who maintained perfect control even during the most emotional interviews, was crying on live television. "I don't know if I can." Johnny started then stopped. He listened. Then, "You never said that. Not once. Not ever." More silence. More listening. Then Johnny's voice, barely above a whisper. "You watched? Every night?" His mother's response lasted nearly 30 seconds. Johnny listened, his face transforming with each word, pain, confusion, hope, and something that looked like a child finally hearing what he'd waited his whole life to hear. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny lowered the phone from his ear briefly and looked at Ed. His eyes were red, his face wet with tears, but his voice was steady. "Ed, I need a minute." Ed nodded immediately. He stepped forward to the desk, putting himself between Johnny and the cameras, a human shield for his friend. "Folks," Ed said to the audience, his voice thick with emotion, "we're going to take a very brief pause here. Stay with us." He signaled to Bobby Quinn in the control room. The director understood immediately. They went to an unplanned commercial break. But the cameras stayed on. The crew kept rolling. Because Fred de Cordova, standing in the control room with tears streaming down his face, knew they were witnessing something that transcended television. During the commercial break, Johnny stayed on the phone. 3 minutes became 5, became 7. Ed stood guard. Doc and the band waited silently. The audience remained in their seats, nobody speaking, everybody understanding that whatever was happening mattered more than schedules or formats or television conventions. When they came back from commercial, Johnny was still at his desk, the phone now resting in its cradle. His eyes were red. His makeup was streaked. He looked exhausted and lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying something heavy for so long he'd forgotten it was there until he finally set it down. He looked into camera 1. Directly at the 15 million people watching at home. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice rough but steady, "I need to tell you something. That phone call was from my mother. I haven't spoken to her in 15 years. I won't go into all the reasons why. They're complicated and personal and probably not that interesting to anyone but me." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But tonight she called to tell me something I've waited my whole life to hear. She told me she's watched this show every single night for 16 years. She told me she's proud of me. And she told me..." His voice cracked again. "She told me she loves me and she never stopped, even when I stopped calling." The audience erupted. Not in applause, this wasn't that kind of moment. In a collective exhale, tears, and recognition that they'd witnessed something sacred. Johnny wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "She's 73 years old. And she just gave me the 6 words I've been waiting for since I was a kid, Johnny, I never stopped loving you." He looked down at the phone on his desk. Then back at the camera. "If there's someone you love and you haven't told them, don't wait 15 years. Don't wait until you're desperate enough to call during a live television show. Just pick up the phone. Tonight." The studio rose as one. Standing ovation. Not for entertainment, but for courage. For vulnerability. For forgiveness witnessed. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show, Johnny flew to Nebraska that weekend. He spent 3 days with his mother. They talked. They cried. They started over. Ruth Carson died 2 years later. Johnny was holding her hand. The last thing she said to him was, "I always watched. Every single night." The phone from that night's show stayed on Johnny's desk for the remaining 14 years of his tenure. He never used it for comedy again. And every night before the show started, he'd touch it once, a reminder that it's never too late to say what matters most.